I read some writing advice from John Steinbeck this week, and it raised some interesting questions for me about how us writers approach our stories. He's most famous for Of Mice and Men, The Grapes of Wrath, and East of Eden, but here's some of John Steinbeck's advice for writers. Abandon the idea that you're ever going to finish. Lose track of the 400 pages and write just one page for each day. Then, when it gets finished, you're always surprised. I think that's really good advice in theory, but it's probably easier said than done, especially when you're writing regularly and you sit down every day to write something. It's really hard not to think about your overall progress. That need to constantly measure progress is one of the things I like least about writing novels, and it's one of the things that put me off for quite some time. I would imagine it could be that way for quite a few writers. I would actually argue that finding a way to stop measuring how far you are through your current project is actually beneficial for your writing. I think it means that you're not thinking about how many words you have left or how many words you've got down so far. You're not stopping thinking, but this is only 30,000 words so far, so I need to find something to fill it with. Instead, you're just following the natural course of the story, and it ends up being as long or as short as it's supposed to be. And that ultimately disappointing if you're trying to write a really long novel and you don't get there in word count. I think it's still beneficial for the story in general because that's how long it was supposed to be, and you're not filling it with filler. Something I think makes this advice even more interesting is thinking about how technology has impacted writing, because I think it would be way easier to put one page aside every day if you were writing on a typewriter or by hand. There's no page number at the bottom, and you can't just make a couple of clicks and figure out what your overall word count is. You just do your page and move on. And I think you could definitely still do that today, even with all our new technology. I just think it's difficult to resist the urge to check in on your word count every now and again. And I think it's hard to just write that one page and then leave it. I think it would take an awful lot of self-control that I don't have. I think that would definitely be an interesting experiment somewhere down the line. I'm switching to typewriter for a few months just to see if my overall feeling on how my project is progressing is the same or different, or if it has any effect at all. Whatever the case, I think not checking your word count before you write, while you're writing, and after you're writing would no doubt be a good thing, so I agree with that tip. Never correct or rewrite until the whole thing is down. Rewriting process is usually found to be an excuse for not going on. In many ways, true I think. Rewriting in the middle of a draft for me has usually meant death for whatever I was writing. It seems to be one of those inevitable patterns for me that I just can't get past whenever I'm writing, especially a novel, because I just want to make sure everything's good first time, and to some extent you think, well, if this isn't right now, how can I go on? How can I stand the rest of the novel on top of this? But you actually can. It doesn't have to be perfect, and most of the time when you look back at things you've already written, when you're outside of it or when the whole draft's finished, it's probably not half as bad as you think it is, or half as detrimental to the rest of the story as you think it is anyway, but I still can't help doing it. However, I acknowledge that that's just something that happens to me. That's my particular affliction. That might not be the case for every writer. In fact, it definitely won't be. For some writers, rewriting and making the first part perfect before you move on to the second part might be just part of their method. It might be how they get through stories, and if they do, by the end of the first draft, I would imagine that the story will be in fantastic shape compared to a lot of first drafts. Also, I think it depends what you're writing. I would definitely rewrite parts of a flash fiction, for example, sentences or the previous paragraph before I finished the whole thing, and not think about that as a big deal at all. Like that, to me, doesn't even really count as rewriting process in the same way that it does for a chapter of a book. I think because with shorter stuff you have to be so hyper focused on how everything's written, it often means the difference between whether the story is going to land or not, whereas one sentence in a novel isn't going to make comparatively as much difference, I would argue. Overall though, I do agree with what Steinbeck said here. I think for the majority of writers, rewriting process probably is some form of procrastination. In writing, your audience is one single reader. I found that sometimes it helps to pick out one person, a real person you know or an imagined person, and write to that one. This is the same concept as an ideal reader, and I think that's something that Stephen King talks about. I think it's Stephen King anyway. I think it makes sense. The idea of writing something that will please 1,000 people seems almost impossible, After all, we all know how hard it is to write something that will please one person. But when you do focus on that one person, you can start thinking about how they might receive different parts of your story. It gives you at least something to go off when you're thinking about how to phrase certain things or from what angle you should tell your story. It gives you some idea of just what you're trying to achieve with it if you think about who the ideal reader might be. If you don't try and narrow your focus to one person, and usually it helps if that's a friendly face, then you leave yourself vulnerable to this idea that there's thousands of different people that you have to please all simultaneously, and I don't know any writer that could ever do that. I suppose what I'm talking about is the transferring of some kind of message. If you're in a room with one person, then it's very easy to transfer a message to them. But if you're in a room with a million people from different walks of life who speak different languages and want different things from your story, you can't really simultaneously deliver that message that's going to satisfy all of them. I don't know if that makes sense to anyone apart from me, but I definitely think it's good practice to imagine who will be reading your story. It doesn't even have to be a real person, as Steinbeck says, but it needs to be one person, one receiver of what you're trying to do, one person to pass the message along to. Helps a lot. If a scene or a section gets the better of you and you still think you want it, bypass it and go on. When you've finished the whole, you can come back to it, and then you may find that the reason it gave you trouble is because it didn't belong there. I should definitely take better notice of this as I'm writing, and to me this raises a question in my mind. Do stories have autonomy of their own? There have definitely been times where I've been writing a story and I've been certain about the direction I'm taking it in, and then when I got there, the story had other ideas and it's gone in a completely different direction. Most of those occasions I think have turned out better for the story than what I'd imagined in the first place, so it's worked to my advantage. But I suppose the opposite could be true as well. There's definitely some benefit to planning everything ahead and then sticking to the plan, because if you do deviate, even if the story calls for it, then anything else you've got planned further down the line, which maybe the book is depending on, stuff like a plot twist or certain information given at a certain time, can be altered, and then it can be difficult to wrangle the whole thing back into line. I suppose it brings us back to the ever-present question of which is better, planning or discovery writing, and there is no better. Everything works differently for every writer in every project. For me, I aim for a kind of hybrid approach where all of the main parts of the story and all of the screws that hold the story in place stay where they are, and then I improvise around that. So I'll decide just how I want to do things as I get to them rather than in advance. That way I stay interested enough because I feel like I haven't told myself the full story yet, but I also know where I want to go next, and I'm able to stick to something that might actually propel me through the story. But there's no doubt about it, I've definitely ground to a halt in the middle of some scenes and lost all my motivation for writing because I've arrived in the wrong place. Whether that was myself and my planning that brought me there, or it was the story taking a turn that I wasn't expecting, one way or the other, the solution is usually to go back and check if you followed the signs correctly. For me, it's just another advertisement for writing a little bit slower so that you have time to figure out where you're going before you have to slam the brakes on. However, there definitely comes a point where slowly and carefully considering everything you write becomes another form of procrastination. If you're using dialogue, say it aloud as you write it. Only then will it have the sound of speech. Another writer reminded me of this just this week in the comments section of one of my other videos, and it's something I've always wanted to try and never got around to. And it does make sense. Surely if you want speech to sound like speech, it should be spoken. Can't really attest to whether it does or doesn't work. It's something I'm definitely going to try in the future, and the only reason that I haven't yet tried it is this weird form of embarrassment. I don't know why I'm embarrassed to read my own dialogue back to myself, even if no one else can hear me, when I'm capable of sitting in front of a camera and talking about writing. I've managed to get past that particular barrier, but this one is just too much for me. I can't do it. I think it's important because unnatural sounding dialogue is a big turn off for a lot of readers, myself included. You might not think that dialogue is even a weakness in your own writing. I don't think it's a particular weakness in mine, but that doesn't mean it can't be made better. That doesn't mean it can't be improved. And if a simple way to improve it is just to read it out loud, everyone has access to that. Overall, I think dialogue is make or break for a story, and if you can get it to sound natural, it's just another level of immersion for your readers, and I think that's always a good thing. I'll try reading my dialogue out loud at some point in the future, and hopefully it'll work for me as it's worked for a lot of other writers, it seems. If there's a magic in story writing, and I'm convinced there is, no one has ever been able to reduce it to a recipe that can be passed from one person to another. The formula seems to lie solely in the aching urge of the writer to convey something he feels important to the reader. I believe this is the very beating heart of your story, and the reason why some stories don't work out. The urge to convey a story or a message to a reader, I think, gives you more energy and more motivation than pretty much any other source I can think of. But how it arrives and how to make it stay, I think, is still pretty much a mystery, certainly is to me. As John Steinbeck says, it's magic. I've written plenty of stories myself and plenty of books without that aching urge of the writer, as Steinbeck puts it. And most of those ended up not even being finished or not even getting anywhere near finished. That's because I didn't have that force that was propelling me through the story. All I had was, this seems like a cool idea, or I really like this particular plot twist, so I'm going to build an entire book around it. And because of that, the stories were forgettable, they were easy to zone out of, and they weren't immersive in any way. That reason, if I'd had it to keep putting words down, would have been the exact same reason, whether they could define it or not, that a reader would stay immersed in the story. And if making readers feel immersed in your story is something that's important to you as a writer, try this video next for some of my ideas about how to achieve that.